When Evan returned to his father's garage after the funeral, he didn't expect grief to feel so empty. No last letter, no final words, just a rusty pickup truck, a dented red toolbox, and a garage that smelled of old oil and colder silences. His father's entire legacy, it seemed, could be fit into a box with broken latches and a glove compartment full of unpaid parking tickets. That was the man Evan had known or thought he knew. The truck keys came in an envelope without a note. His mother simply handed them over, said something vague like your dad would have wanted you to have it, and walked back inside. She hadn't called Evan by name in years, not since the night he came out, and his father had stared at the wall for what felt like hours before quietly walking out the door. That silence had stayed between them ever since, growing heavier with time. Evan stood alone in the garage, the same place he'd once built soapbox cars with his dad, long before labels like gay or not good enough or disappointment came between them. He ran his hand over the hood of the truck, fingers tracing the familiar dents and sun-faded paint. It looked exactly the same, but felt like a stranger. He opened the driver's side door and slid in, expecting nothing more than dust, but there was something off. The seat cover, patched in places with old fabric, had a strange square stitched into the corner. Evan reached under and found a hidden pocket. Inside was a single folded note with 3 words, printed in bold, unfamiliar handwriting. Check the box. He blinked. No signature, no explanation, just a message that could have meant anything, except Evan knew which box. His father's toolbox, the one that had followed him through every garage job from Kansas to Spokane. Evan had always been told not to touch it. For years, he had assumed that box held wrenches, grease, and everything that smelled like rejection. He never dared open it, not after that night, not after the sound of the slammed door and the years of silence that followed. But now the box sat at his feet, staring up at him like an unopened wound. He hesitated, hands shaking, then unlatched the lid. It wasn't full of tools. Not anymore. There were still a few sockets and screwdrivers, sure. But they sat loosely around a tightly wrapped cloth parcel tucked in the corner, like it didn't belong. Evan unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a USB drive, scratched, with a single word etched onto a piece of blue tape for Evan. He froze. For the first time in over a decade, his father had written his name. It didn't feel real. What kind of man hides a message like this? What kind of father says nothing while he's alive but leaves behind breadcrumbs in a box no one was ever allowed to open? The USB felt heavier than its weight. It felt like a key to something Evan had already locked away years ago. He slipped it into his pocket, unsure whether to throw it into a fire or drive straight home and plug it in. But something held him still. A question he never thought he'd ask. What if there was something left to hear as he locked the garage and stepped back into the truck he never wanted? From the man who never said goodbye, Evan realized something had shifted. He hadn't just inherited a vehicle, he had inherited a mystery. And maybe even a second chance. If you've ever wondered what love sounds like from someone who never said it aloud, stay with us. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more true stories of the unexpected ways love survives even in silence. Evan didn't plug in the USB right away. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in the cab of the truck until the evening sun dipped below the power lines, painting the quiet street in soft rust. Something about holding that little drive felt like holding a confession, not meant for the living, as if turning it on would unravel the version of his father he had spent years carefully distancing himself from. The next morning, he took the truck to be checked out. It had sat idle for nearly a year since his father's stroke. The tires were low, the engine slow to wake. Still, the bones of it were strong, stubborn, even just like the man who once drove it every day without fail, rain or snow. Evan brought it to a local garage, not expecting anything more than a standard tune-up. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with him yet. The shop had changed hands. The familiar sign now read Joaquin's Auto and Repair in fresh blue paint. Evan blinked at the name. Joaquin, the quiet kid who used to sweep the garage floors back when they were both teenagers. His dad used to bark orders at the boy like he was a drill sergeant, but Joaquin never flinched. He was always there, even after Evan had left home. Joaquin recognized him before Evan could say a word. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said, wiping grease from his hands as he approached. There was no judgment in his voice, just a quiet, surprised warmth. "Sorry about your dad." Evan nodded, unsure what to say. Sorry didn't cover it, not when the loss was tangled in silence. He explained he'd found the old pickup among his father's things and wanted to get it back on the road. Joaquin listened, then tilted his head slightly. "Did you find it?" he asked. Find what? Joaquin walked around the truck, tapped on the hood twice, then pointed to the driver's door. "He told me if you ever came back and took the truck, I should give you this." He disappeared into the office and returned with a small tin box, sealed with black electrical tape. On top, in blocky handwriting, were the words, "Do not open before June 10th. Evan stared at it. That date was a week away. Joaquin looked hesitant. "He made me promise. Said it was important. Like, really important." The weight of it settled in Evan's hands like something sacred. It didn't make sense. His father hadn't spoken to him in 10 years, not a single birthday. Not even when Evan graduated or published his first research paper. And yet here was this box, a date, a plan. Back at home, Evan finally gave in. He plugged the USB into his laptop, heart pounding. Inside was a single folder labeled "To my son." He opened it. There were no spreadsheets, no financial documents, just a series of audio files, numbered. The first one started automatically. "If you're hearing this, I guess I'm gone. I don't know what to say. You were always smarter with words than I ever was, but I hope you'll listen anyway." Evan froze. It was his father's voice, aged, gravelly, and slow. He hadn't heard it in years. "I didn't handle things right. Not when you told us. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would go away. But it didn't, and I'm glad it didn't. I watched your talks online, saw that speech you gave about being queer in tech. I watched it 5 times, maybe more." Evan couldn't breathe. The voice continued. "I didn't know how to reach you, so I built something. I built this truck for you. The seat cover that was your jersey, the handle from your first bike. I collected all these scraps like maybe I could stitch them together and tell you what I never could." Evan's fingers trembled over the keyboard. The next file was shorter. "You deserve better. I wanted to be the kind of man who could say the words out loud. I wasn't, so I'm leaving them here." The rest of the files were dated, spread across months. His father had recorded entries like a journal, chronicling every time he tried and failed to pick up the phone, every time he watched Evan's interviews, scribbled down notes, then erased them. There were even notes to himself, reminders to learn how to pronounce non-binary, to look up the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. Evan pressed play on the final entry in the folder. His father's voice cracked this time. "Son, if this truck still runs, maybe you'll drive it somewhere I never got to go with you. Maybe you'll take someone you love and just go. That's what I wanted. You free." Evan leaned back, eyes stinging. The truck hadn't just been a machine. It had been a monument. Every scratch, every weld, every replaced part had been an act of silent apology. And somehow, without ever saying the words in life, his father had built them into steel. For days, Evan couldn't stop replaying the recordings. He listened to them in his sleep, as if the gravel in his father's voice could smooth over years of silence. But one detail refused to settle. In the very first audio clip, there was a pause after the words, "To my son," a hesitation, like his father had started to say another name before settling on his. And then there was the folder buried within the USB one he hadn't noticed at first. It was named "To my boys," plural. Evan stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside were duplicate audio files, but with different tags: Ash, bike crash, expulsion, 19 hour. Some were voice memos, Others were scanned letters never sent. One document caught Evan's breath, a medical report, dated when he was 14, labeled with a name he hadn't heard since childhood. Ash Montgomery, a boy who used to live with them for a few months, maybe longer. Evan's memories of him were blurred by time, but they hadn't vanished. Ash had been quiet, always sketching in his notebooks, folding paper into birds and leaving them around the house. Back then, Evan thought Ash was just another foster kid his dad was helping out. But now, things didn't add up. One memory returned sharper than the rest. A summer afternoon wearing a treehouse, a kiss tentative, trembling, and real. Then, sirens in his father's voice, screaming, and the next day, Ash was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. He'd thought he imagined it, or maybe blocked it out, but the documents on the USB told a different story. Ash had been sent away not back to foster care, but to a religious re-education facility upstate, paid for, in part, by Evan's father. His stomach turned. How could the same man who secretly recorded pride speeches and saved clippings of Evan's work have done something like that? How could he say "I love you" to one son in steel and bury another in silence? Evan called his mother. She answered after the third ring, cautious as always. "What is it now?" she said. "Do you remember Ash?" The line went cold. "I've found things, files, Dad's voice, letters, about him." Her sigh was barely audible, but heavy. "You should leave that alone." "Why?" Evan asked. "He was living with us. We were friends." She said nothing. "Was he my brother?" Still silence. "Then your father made mistakes." "That's not an answer. He didn't know how to fix things. He never did." Evan ended the call. His hands trembled, not from anger, but from a feeling far deeper: betrayal layered over understanding, grief tangled with confusion. If Ash had been adopted, or even intended to be adopted, then what happened? What part of Evan's coming out had triggered the exile of not just one son, but both? He needed answers. He returned to the garage the next morning, hoping Joaquin might know more. The man had grown into his own, taller now, more grounded, grease still on his knuckles, but gentleness in his gaze. Joaquin didn't act surprised when Evan asked. "I figured you'd find out eventually," Joaquin said, leaning on the workbench. "Your dad never talked about him, but he kept pictures. One time, he asked me to track down a box of drawings, said a friend of his left them behind. I knew it wasn't a friend. Do you know where he is now?" Evan asked. Joaquin hesitated, then walked into the back room. He returned with a dusty envelope. "He left this for you, if you ever came asking." Inside was a single note. The handwriting was unmistakable, angular, tight his father's. "If he finds Ash, tell him to give this to him. If not, tell him I'm sorry." The envelope also held a small thumb drive and a folded page torn from a manual. On it was an address in Montana. Evan sat on the truck bed, the envelope in his lap, trying to make sense of what his father had intended. It wasn't just an apology, it was an inheritance of guilt, handed from one son to another. His father had tried to build something for Evan, a truck, a map, a voice through time, but he'd also erased someone in the process. The man who'd never once attended Evan's school play or graduation had somehow kept tabs on a boy no one even remembered. Or maybe everyone had simply chosen to forget. Evan looked out toward the open road. Montana was only a few hundred miles north, far enough to change your name, far enough to become someone else. And maybe, just maybe so, far enough for two fractured paths to meet again. Evan arrived in Montana with more questions than he'd left with. The drive had taken him through towns his father never talked about, across bridges his GPS didn't recognize, and into a landscape that felt both alien and oddly familiar. The address was scrawled on an oil-stained page. No zip code, no last name, just a town, a road, and a house number written by someone who'd hoped a son would follow directions better than he ever followed love. The house was modest, a faded green porch, wind chimes fashioned from bottle caps, a mailbox painted with a hand-drawn dragon. It didn't look like the kind of place built by someone trying to disappear. It looked like someone had survived here. Evan knocked once, then again. A figure appeared behind the screen door, lean, wary, older than he remembered, but unmistakably Ash. The years had drawn sharper edges into his face, but the way he held his arms close to his sides, the slight flinch in his eyes when he saw Evan, that hadn't changed. Ash opened the door slowly, his voice hoarse. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Neither of them moved for a long moment. Evan finally broke the silence, holding up the envelope. "I think this is yours." Ash took it without a word, his fingers brushing Evan's for a second longer than necessary. He stepped aside. Evan entered, heart racing. The house smelled like cinnamon and sawdust. Paper cranes still littered the windowsills. On the kitchen wall, someone had framed a drawing of a red truck with mismatched wheels. Evan recognized it immediately. He'd drawn it when he was 9. He never remembered giving it away. Ash poured tea. They sat. No one said the word father. Not yet. Instead, Evan placed the USB on the table. He recorded things. For me, for you, for both of us. I think Ash didn't look surprised, just tired. "I figured," he said, "after he sent me away. I used to wonder if he'd regret it. But that's the thing about silence. It's easy to confuse it with peace." He recorded an apology. Evan offered. Ash smiled faintly. "He owed you more than an apology." Evan hesitated, and Ash exhaled. "He owed me nothing. Or maybe everything. I'm not sure anymore." Then, gently, he reached across the table and placed a photograph in Evan's hands. It was old, faded. Evan and Ash in a treehouse, dirt on their faces. One of them mid-laugh, the other leaning in too close. A moment before it all broke. "I kept this," Ash said, "Boz, not because of him, but because of you." Evan's throat closed. There were things too tangled for language. Shame, longing, half-grown emotions that had never had space to become anything real. But here they were, two men grown from the same storm, sitting across from each other like survivors of a shipwreck that neither had caused. "I think he wanted us to meet again," Evan said. Ash nodded. He probably did, in the only way he knew how from a distance. They sat for hours, trading fragments of memory. Ash spoke of the re-education camp, the cold showers, the sermons. Evan told him about the USB, the truck, the speech their father had watched in secret. Ash listened carefully, but not with surprise, more like recognition, as if he had always suspected his pain hadn't been solitary. At some point, Evan pulls out the second thumb drive from the envelope, the one labeled "If He Finds Ash." They played it on Ash's old laptop. Their father's voice filled the room again, rough and strained. "Ash, if you're hearing this, I don't expect forgiveness. I won't ask for it. What I did sending you away, it was fear. Not faith, not love. Just fear, dressed up in the name of protection." There was a pause, then softer. "You were never the shame I thought you were. You were just braver than I could handle. I see that now." Ash looked away. His shoulders trembled. Not quite tears, but something near it. The recording ended with a line neither of them expected. "I had 2 sons. The world only saw one. That's on me. But if this reaches you, please, don't let each other go again." Evan didn't speak. Neither did Ash. The silence this time was different. Not cold, not distant, just full of grief, of what-ifs, of the terrible beauty of second chances. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, Evan reached for the photo again. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the son who had to choose between being himself and being loved. He felt like a brother. Evan spent 3 more days in Montana. Not because he had to, but because something about Ash's quiet way of existing made the past feel less sharp. They didn't talk much about what had happened between them as kids, about the kiss, the punishment, the years erased. That pain had already spoken loud enough. Instead, they spent time in the silences between words, fixing a broken screen door, watching clouds move over the mountains, sharing a pot of coffee each morning without needing to fill the air. Before Evan left, he walked out to the truck. It sat in the driveway like it had always belonged there. The sun lit its hood in warm gold. He'd never imagined keeping it before, but now it felt like something earned, not from inheritance, but from understanding. Ash joined him by the open door, holding a small cloth pouch. He left these too, he said. Inside were keys not to the truck, but to the old garage back home. Said if we ever wanted to do something with the place, it was ours. Evans smiled softly. I thought I'd sell it. Ash shrugged. You still can. Or we could fix it up. Maybe make it a place where people don't have to hide who they are. That idea stuck. When Evan returned to Seattle, the truck came with him. He drove the entire way, alone but not really. Every hour on the road felt like a page turning, as if steel and oil could carry memory, and asphalt could wear down regret. He passed signs for places he'd lived, spots he'd avoided. Each mile behind the wheel rewrote something he hadn't known still needed rewriting. The garage was still standing barely, peeling paint, cracked windows. A vine had claimed the west wall, but when Evan unlocked the door, it was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything his father hadn't thrown away was still there: the radio, the old stool, even the faded poster of the Seahawks hanging crookedly behind the workbench. He found the final surprise beneath the floorboards. A panel loose under the far corner. Inside, a letter in an envelope labeled simply, "If you stayed." Evan opened it with steady hands. Son, Posti, it began. If you're reading this, you've stayed longer than I deserve. Thank you, Guo. You always saw the world in color. I only knew how to build with gray, but I hope the pieces I left you are enough to start again. Whatever this place becomes, let it be something better than I was. Let it be honest. Let it be kind. There was no signature. Just those final lines. Evan sat down on the concrete floor and stared at the letter until the sun shifted across the window panes. He didn't cry, not out of hardness, but because something else had grown in place of the ache, something closer to stillness, a life unpaused. Months passed. The garage reopened under a new name, the quiet machine part auto shop, part youth workshop space. Ash moved back to help run it. Together, they rebuilt the space not just with their hands, but with everything their father never knew how to give. The old truck stayed parked out front, untouched. Visitors thought it was just decoration. Only Evan and Ash knew it was the very first story ever told in the language of tools and silence. Sometimes Evan would sit inside it after hours, replay one of the recordings from the USB. Not because he needed to hear his father's voice, but because he finally could. The final recording was short. If you've listened this far, maybe I wasn't as far gone as I thought. And then quietly, thank you for finding me. What if the love you needed was always there, just buried in the wrong language? Have you ever discovered someone's heart after they were gone? Tell us your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it. Subscribe to Hard Stories for more real, emotional journeys of forgiveness, family, and the things we find when we least expect them.